And we are live. For those of you who are new to this, normally I talk about guns and optics, but since Russia decided to get adventurous in Ukraine, I find myself talking about politics a little bit more than I usually do. I do appreciate you joining us. Normally these run for a couple hours, and naturally I would appreciate it if whoever is already here put a note in the chat that you can hear me well. I do occasionally have audio problems. I assume you can hear me. Anyhow, today I don't have the full 2 hours. I'm getting ready to go hunting. And as much as I care about Ukraine, I care more about going hunting with my kids. It is something much more immediate, much more of an immediate concern for me. I know it sounds callous, but I'm sure you'll forgive me. We have about an hour. That means that if it goes the way it usually does, I will not be able to get to all of the questions. I will filter through and pick out the ones that look most interesting. Make your questions stand out if you want us to address it on air. Eugene is joining me again today. I'm going to add him to the stream momentarily. He's been much more up to speed on all the Ukrainian stuff than I have. I've been doing a lot of traveling, so it's hard to keep up. So let's see what is happening, if there's anything new and exciting. Eugene, welcome.
Hello.
All right. So where shall we start?
Wherever you want.
Okay. Let's do the question that I get hit with the most, because apparently everybody's convinced that I have inside knowledge of the biolabs in Ukraine.
We talk about biolabs.
Let's do biolabs. So give me a summary, if you don't mind. What is happening with biolabs? What did we find? What seems to be conjecture and what seems like real thing?
Yeah, this is one of those things where a reality is much less exciting, but because on one hand we have malice, on the other hand we have incompetence, it became a very big story. So Russia identified that there is a biolab in Ukraine. This was very sophisticated intelligence operation. They went to DoD website dating back to 2008, where in clear text we described that there is a collaboration between DoD and this biolab in Ukraine. The backstory there was that we had the bioweapons lab throughout Soviet Union. And in 2004, United States decided that maybe it's not a good idea to have those labs where potentially things could get repurposed, and we'll have scientists who have history of working on biological weapons who do not know what they're doing. So we'll establish collaborations with those labs to work on non-military projects. And lab was downgraded from level 4, which is kind of typically what you need for anthrax and deadly stuff, to level 3, which is tuberculosis, another thing where you can vaccinate against, and otherwise they're not deadly. And we're on projects, and we kind of partially paid for some of the research projects, and not unlike in Wuhan lab, where we paid for the research projects.
Okay.
So yes, and this became a big deal because obviously kind of discovered by Russia. The only reason why you would have such a lab is because you want to kill Russians. Never mind that such labs exist literally in every single country in Europe. Now and then, White House enters the picture, and Jen Psaki gives resounding refutation, where she literally comes out and says that this is disinformation and we're watching you, Russia. And otherwise does not explain the situation at all. And if,
okay, to be fair, first of all, so her name is Jen Psaki. I think it's much more appropriate to invert it and just call her Psaki Jen. I think it's more descriptive and more accurate. Not the sexual way. She's just, as a politician, press secretary, she sucks. But anyhow. And that's point number one. Point number two, so it is a functioning biological laboratory that employs people who do some sort of research that is partially subsidized by us, partially is a Ukrainian thing and all that.
Correct. And this is not a complicated story to tell, but the way White House told it, it made everybody suspicious. So anyways, they're able to tell non-complicated information in such a way that makes it sound very sinister. And of course, Russia all along was planning to give a sinister angle to the story. So anyways, I think it's one of those things that has much to do about nothing.
So I keep on hearing stories that there are 20 labs and they're super mysterious and all that sort of stuff. Is there any credence to this? that there is a large number of those spread all over the country, or is it just one specific institution that you know of?
Yes, I believe there is more than one. I don't know about 20 labs. That I haven't heard that. None of them are mysterious, again, because like the main reconnaissance happens on our DoD website and website of Institutes of Virology and other NIH, other institutes that provide grants, including to foreign institutions. That's how those were.
So, okay. So, all right. If you can find them on the DoD website, probably not that mysterious. Although it would be, in some ways, very entertaining to find Ukraine flu instead of Wuhan flu, or Kiev flu, or Kharkiv flu, wherever the hell they are. That's interesting. So Jared's pointing out that Putin is saying that the war was inevitable and there's genocide and all that. Look, he has to justify the war in some way, shape, or form. And once he said it, he can't back down, right? He has to repeat the story, because if what is he going to say, that the war was unjustified and I was just having fun? I mean, right?
I guess my range of options for Ukraine, at least as far as statistically, shrunk quite a bit. I think that it's probably going to end via negotiations one way or another, because Russia knows they lost, in the sense that there is no way for them to occupy a 44 million person country. They do not have the manpower, they do not have the money for this. At the same time, basically the main conversation is, what are the terms? And until he believes that continuing the war may improve his chances to strong arm Ukraine into concessions, he'll continue. As soon as he believes it's less advantageous, he will in earnest engage in negotiations. My expectation is that we're rapidly approaching the moment where I do not think he feels he's making any headway. So unfortunately, you do not know until it actually happens, but I do not think Russia can last another month.
Okay, that's a fair point. They'll run out of pretty much everything. It's going to be very interesting to see what form of negotiations, what they can agree on, what is acceptable, or on sufficiently acceptable, I guess, to all of the involved parties. I am always concerned that our erstwhile president is just going to go send somebody there and to bend over and push.
So in this case, I'm fairly confident that Ukraine at this point will not accept very onerous terms. So I think they probably will, basically restoration of status quo with Russia providing compensation, which in Russia is going to be described as friendly assistance. It's going to be viewed as operations in Ukraine. But something of that sort may work, and Putin will claim that it was denazified, we destroyed all their weapons, which was the goal all along. I'm claiming that's probably kind of the most likely scenario, but it could swing in both directions depending how next.
That's a fair point. What do you think is going to happen to the Donetsk and Lugansk areas? Are they going to peel off to become independent? There will be still lingering conflict there. Will Russia absorb it?
I do not, and again, like obviously I'm not sitting there discussing it with Ukrainian government, but just to be clear, Ukrainian president is not a dictator, even if he personally feels compelled. After so many casualties, there are only a certain range of terms that will be acceptable by the rest of the country. So I do not believe that entire territory of Donetsk and Lugansk, as in administrative borders, would be something that Ukraine accepts, because, as I said, this is more than the status quo. They probably would accept administrative autonomy of those areas within the borders that were controlled by insurgents, and they may want to insist on peacekeepers on the border to avoid kind of conversations about being attacked by Ukrainian Nazis in the future.
Yeah, that's fair. So Brooks Precision makes sort of a somber point that lots of civilians are being killed now by the Russians. Does it look like the Russian military is changing its tactics or beginning to go after civilians more, encircling and leveling cities? I mean, they're kind of trying to do that in Mariupol, right?
They're going heavily after civilians because, honestly, I think they're not capable to go after military targets right now. So Mariupol is in a worse situation. It's surrounded. There were several attempts to establish humanitarian corridor. Something like 1,000 to 2,000 civilians got out, but this is nothing compared to 200 to 300,000 civilian population. Kharkov is under heavy bombardment, but militarily, Russia actually is losing near Kharkov. They've been kind of pushed back somewhat. And similarly, the story with Kiev. There were conversations about second offense on Kiev just 3 days ago, and more kind of humorously, Kadyrov claimed to fly in to personally oversee.
Yeah, I've heard that that the war cannot happen without Kadyrov. Yes,
right.
So for those who don't know, Kadyrov is a dictator of Chechnya, so he's a major Putin supporter.
But actually, the opposite happened. The counteroffensive by Ukrainians happened, and they were able to push Russians out of few suburbs of Kiev. So currently, I think this is as close to a stalemate as you can have across such a broad country. There was, even in the south, Russia was advancing up until a few days ago, and now the advance was kind of more or less checked across most directions.
Yeah, I think they got stopped at Nikolaev, right?
Correct.
Or Mykolaiv, as Ukrainians call it. Right.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So Jared brings up a point whether Russia would be willing to give up Kaliningrad, which used to be called Königsberg, used to be Germany before World War II, for Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. Poland could then compensate Ukraine. So first of all, the area where Kaliningrad is used to be Germany, not Poland. So I don't think they're going to give it to Poland. They're also not going to give it to Germany. Putin has nukes in Kaliningrad, and it's a major base for Russian submarines. They need Kaliningrad just like they need Crimea for the Black Sea Fleet. If to force Russia to give up that Kaliningrad is nuclear war, they're not giving it up. So yeah. So Brooks Precision is saying that something about Russian missiles, but that yet their troops seem to be sitting ducks. The whole sitting duck thing is kind of interesting. You know, I'm not a really military guy. You are. But whenever I look at them, they just move somewhere, safe distance from a major city, and just sit there.
Well, so
like a new military maneuver I'm not aware of?
No, it's. I mean, it is a maneuver, very detrimental to your troops. But yeah, unfortunately, there's nothing else they can do. I was discussing it with a friend of mine. The Russian supply lines are in a horrible state. Kind of like we can have deeper discussion about kind of use of tanks, etc. I actually both had conversations and had notes about it, but they consume a lot of fuel. If you're not able to supply fuel, they make just about the perfect target. They're big, slow, etc. And if you cannot advance into the cities, if you cannot move fast between the cities, you're a target. And most of the Russian forces find themselves in that situation. Today, one of the army headquarters was shelled by Ukraine, killing a lot of senior officers. They do not know. They expect that multiple generals perished, but they do not have exact casualty report. Mm-hmm. And basically, the main reason is that they were sitting there for days, and that made it very easy to get artillery in place and shell them. You do not do that.
Yeah. Generally, Jared is talking about how poorly the Russians are doing in this war. Something that's worth pointing out, the whole business with so much armor moving around in a competition between not necessarily major powers, but somewhat modern militaries. Russians are fighting war like they would in 1960s, right? The way they would try to suppress uprisings in Czech Republic and Hungary. Right, they think that tanks are viable primary offensive weapons. The moment weapons like javelins, NLAWs, and others were invented, tanks stopped being a big deal. That's basically it.
Correct, and I think this is one of the major learnings from Ukraine. So notably, Marine Corps gave up tanks last year because they do not serve sufficient role in light infantry assault to justify the logistic problems dealing with tanks. And Russia, just a kind of perfect example of why tanks today is not what it used to be.
Correct.
When it becomes very easy for infantrymen to engage them, and given how much supply stress that they put on the entire unit, it's not clear what is the utility of tanks. Tanks are good in fighting other tanks. If you do not have tank-on-tank battles, utility of a tank is fairly small.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. I can probably think of some specific applications where we're doing some very asymmetric things where a tank may have some utility. But as far as major tank being the major weapon of war that it used to be, World War II to a significant degree was a tank war, right? I think that those times are gone.
Yeah, both Israel and United States, we use tanks during urban combat as kind of mobile defense /
Exactly.
artillery. But one, if you have aerial support, that works better. And two, if your enemy has good anti-tank weaponry, not RPGs that we faced in Iraq, but actual anti-tank weaponry, the utility becomes very marginal and cost of tank is pretty high.
I very much agree with it. You also want to keep in mind that as far as tanks go, Russian tanks versus Israeli or American tanks are very, very different things. Russian tanks, even the modern ones, they're a little bit smaller, lighter, more mobile. They are actually designed for tank against tank warfare that Eugene was just talking about a moment ago. That's what they're for. If you look at the drawing side by side, Israeli Merkava or the M1 Abrams tank are much larger than Russian tanks. Why? They have very heavy armor. They don't need the mobility to avoid other tanks. They do need to carry a lot of stuff. And Merkava is even a troop carrier to some degree. You can actually stuff quite a few people in there. Right. Russian tanks are really not designed for modern warfare. Okay, so let's take a couple of questions, and then I really want to talk about China because China is doing something occasionally odd. Mr. Navyman, southern Russian military units have trained together and are having much more success versus the northern or eastern forces. But overall, they've lost their momentum. Yeah, and even in the south, I mean, they can train together all they want, but they are relying on mechanized armored vehicles too much. America and Europe shipped so many effective anti-tank and modern anti-tank weapons out that way that they were bound to stall. They would have some initial inertia, and then that's it.
It's an interesting thought. I have not seen a comparison of composition of the units, but also what's obvious is South was much less defended. They didn't have a larger population area. I mean, Kharkov and Kyiv are two biggest metropolises in Ukraine, Odessa being the third one. There's nothing of that size in the south, so that's correct. Probably also part of it.
Yeah, they took Kherson, and then they went to southern troops went toward Odessa and got stuck nowhere near it. Right, so. Stephanie Music, showing that they do not have coordinated combined arms, tactics, and strategy, poor communications and logistics. That is very accurate. Eugene talked about it last time. Some of the lessons they learned from after invading Georgia, apparently they didn't learn very well. So, and last thing before we move on, in general, Russia's equipment looks like crap. So Eugene and I both grew up in Russia. We came to the US as teenagers. Something that you have to keep in mind. In Russia, you can build an amazing one of anything, sometimes two. But when you need to build 50 of them, Russian way of doing things basically falls apart. They cannot produce anything modern and complicated than any sort of a reasonable quantity. That's just maybe vestiges of communist economy, something. They are just not good in building complicated things in quantities. They can build a lot of AK-47s. But even their modern tanks, they can't build a lot of those. That's why you see basically old and dilapidated crap mostly.
But at the same time, I also don't think this is the key to their failure. So yes, obviously having unencrypted radios and having cell-based communication where you knock out towers and need to buy Ukrainian local phone cards to call from unit to unit, yeah, that's silly. But it's really logistics failure. They have never operated kind of logistics-heavy campaign like this, and that failed dramatically. And by the way, on the Ukrainian side, I was impressed in the opposite direction. It's very much a grassroots framework that they have in place, but it works very well. And I talk to people, a couple of networks, and they have phone numbers of people in different locations in Ukraine. They're able to check the status of supplies, deliver them very efficiently. So it doesn't matter if it's homegrown as long as it works.
So here's a good question. I was going to move on to China, but I think this is a nice one to address. Isn't Russian success inevitable if they keep attacking? I'm not aware of Ukraine having recaptured territory. I used to think that Russian eventual success is inevitable. Now I'm not so sure. I think the cost is too high. Remember, the war has been going on for less than a month. It's too early for Ukrainians to start recapturing territory. And so going back to World War II, there is a famous phrase that was won with Russian blood and American money. And hearing that phrase, everybody starts discarding the effect of American money. Don't. Ukraine is being resupplied, and it will continue by Europe and America to some degree, but basically by everyone. Russia is using up what they have, and they are going to be running out of everything. The logistical problems Eugene was just talking about are absolutely paramount, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. Russia can nuke Ukraine. Russia can destroy Ukraine so that it basically becomes a radioactive wasteland for the next 1,000 years. But they cannot take over and contain it by conventional means. It looks like they can't, because Ukrainians don't want to be Russians. That's one thing that became really apparent from all this. This whole business of Ukraine and Russia being the same people with the same national identity fell flat on its face. They are resisting with all they've got, and they are more resolved than Russians are. Not as many Ukrainians, but 40 million people who are very much resolved to fight back is no picnic.
Okay. I think that when I said that Russia has a month or so left, that's based on specific numbers of depletion to the best I can gather them. For instance, I believe that Russia is at 50% of their air capability right now. So they have a lot of planes, but not all of them fly. They have even fewer pilots who know how to fly. And they have been taking sufficient losses. So it sounds like nothing, 60 aircrafts, etc. This is half of their capable air force. Similarly, they threw their best forces in the first wave. I do not think they have the same quality forces for successive waves. Sending more conscripts, it sounds like you're doubling down, but in reality, you're just compounding the mess. It's not going to solve your logistics problem. It's not going to improve coordination between units. It's only increasing kind of toll and complexity of the operation.
Yeah, that's a very, very fair point. All right, so let's switch gears for a little bit, and let's talk about China. We'll been talking about Russia all the time. So is China sending mixed signals or clear signals that we didn't expect? What's the deal with China?
China. Well, I think on the face, China will obviously not be on the Western side in this conflict, and they will resist as much as possible. But from what I see and from what I hear from people who are able to watch and understand Chinese media, there has been some shifts. Initially, they were very much kind of pro-Putin. They were able to repeat a lot of the talking points, and they were very openly on the same side. Then some cracks started to form when they started talking about heroic resistance. It was in the social media, not official sources.
Okay.
And now official source, but the social media still means censorship allows.
Correct. Yeah. Chinese social media is not exactly independent sources.
Correct. And now my understanding is that recognition of civilian casualties among Ukrainians appear in state media. And kind of all of those signals, including what got discovered that Russia asked for logistical help from China and clearly didn't get it, tells us something about it. So China very much wants Russian oil, but they do not want Russian mess.
So, but I mean, if China ends up being Russia's only customer, are they basically just going to bend them over the fence and set prices in a way that Russia doesn't want?
Yeah, I mean, the way I view it is Putin very much wanted to be an equal partner to China. And this would be a demonstration that this is a big, strong country that you want to have on your side. He kind of convinced them of the opposite, that it's a kind of big, nasty, unorganized country that has oil, and oil has a lot of utility. So China definitely wants to have access to natural resources, but I do not think they feel that it's important for them to be associated with the political mass.
Yeah. So I don't think anybody is hugely impressed with the Russian performance here. So there is a very pointed question from Mr. Joe Kihorik. I'll let you field this one, but my only comment here is that we cannot nuke California until Eugene moves out of there. So that's my official position on the subject.
I will probably not engage in serious conversations about
I know. And China will ultimately screw Russia over, absolutely. The question is how, not whether China will screw Russia over. The question is how badly, right? Okay. So it's an interesting point. So Chinese media is sort of opening up to not being terribly pro-Russian, still not pro-Western, but not as pro-Russian as they used to be. I saw a note somewhere that in a discussion, some Chinese diplomat was saying, well, we've been sending supplies and supporting Ukraine all along, which is kind of interesting. I'm not sure what they've been sending, but that was a part of an interview with the Chinese officials. So I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. It's going to be really interesting to see how all this ends. If you're right and it ends in some sort of a negotiation like that, will any countries make territorial claims on Russia? And China could potentially be one of them. So
I mean, I think that definitely at this point, China wants to be Russian favored customer for their oil. That's very much in their interest. What we discussed before, it's interesting enough, like China wants Russia to lose because they want oil, and United States doesn't want Ukraine to win too seriously because what if Russia becomes mad? And we're kind of helping, but not so decisively that it leaves no doubt in Putin's mind.
Yeah, I don't know about that. So interesting comment. So it's a good time to load Taiwan up with weaponry. I think if you load Taiwan up with more weaponry than they already have, they'll start spilling over into the water. They've been on a shopping spree for quite a few years now. There is an interesting thing here, right? So when this whole thing started, everybody was very concerned that China will look at Russian success and decide to go after Taiwan. Not so sure I'm too much on board with it. I think if there is anything that China learned out of this is that the West weaponized the dollar and absolutely destroyed Russia's ability to function in the modern world. And attacking Taiwan might result in something similar done to China. Now, China is much more integrated with the Western world than Russia is. So it would be much more difficult. But still, basically, this whole weaponized dollar, if you wish, turned out to be a really interesting exercise. Surprisingly, there should be a lesson there for China that they have to wait a little longer. So let's see. Oh, that's interesting. So Russia asked to use Union Pay, and India put restrictions on use of the card processor. It opens up issues with one road and Chinese people. Yeah, you kind of to trade internationally. It turns out you still need dollar, and there's no real replacement, not anytime soon. Oh, this is a good one. Jared, maybe China will provide assistance, military equipment, or financial in exchange for a Russian aircraft carrier. China is building up its navy. I sure hope that China gets one of Russian aircraft carriers. That would be so awesome for us.
Sorry. First of all, Russia has only one aircraft carrier, right?
They have Admiral Kuznetsov, and China can have it if they can keep it floating, which is not so easy.
That's right. It's not a pride of aircraft carrier world. Yeah, but China can wait till conflict is over and then place the bid on aircraft. So there is no
there's no rush for China.
Yeah.
But yeah, with this Russian aircraft carrier, Admiral Kuznetsov, there was this whole mess with it. It was a couple of years ago when it was trying to sink in the Mediterranean, and there was this whole attempt to make it look good while preventing it from sinking. It was hilarious.
Yeah.
Bill Crane, why wouldn't China give logistics support to Russia so Russia is overcommitted to Ukraine, then invade southern Russia? So China doesn't have a border with southern Russia. That's one problem. Another problem is that the border that China does have with Russia, if you try to invade, it becomes an even bigger problem than Russia than is having with Ukraine. There's a lot of space, very, very difficult terrain, incredibly complicated logistics, and there is nothing there. So to get to anything in Russia that China really wants, you have to go really far north from Russian-Chinese border. And how you keep that territory controlled and occupied is an absolute logistic mystery. I think it's going to be much cheaper for China to just buy stuff from Russia rather than invade.
Well, unless they want the land themselves, which is pretty open for anyone for the taking.
That's fair. So for a little while, there was a big thing with Chinese moving across Amur River. So I did a bunch of research on that. They sort of stopped simply because there is a lot of land, but that's not where their current problems are. I mean, very, very far forward looking, maybe. China no longer has a growing population. They're not really itching for land. They have other problems. They need resources, but not so much land. I mean, if there was oil right in the border with China, I mean, I would, maybe. But as it is right now, I really doubt it. So let's see. Has Taiwan been buying the right stuff? So Taiwan has been buying stuff that is not as modern as ours, but still better than the Chinese. I think that's the best way I can phrase this. And forgive me for a vague answer. That's one of those things I really can't talk about. So Stephanie Music. Taiwan has been buying very effective anti-aircraft and anti-ship missile systems. Correct. And which is sort of a big deal for it. Okay. The big thing with Taiwan is that for China, if it's the same as Russia with Ukraine, right? If China really wanted to make Taiwan into a nuclear wasteland, they probably can. But occupy it so that TSMC is not destroyed and holding it, I mean, that's a different ballgame. And if you think armored assault at the Ukraine is difficult, try amphibious assault at Taiwan. Compared to that, walking across Ukraine with a tank is child's play. Eugene, did you do any amphibious assault trainings when you were in the Corps?
Yes. I mean, I think that basically military that doesn't use some capability gets antiquated quite quickly. So I bet our amphibious assaults resemble Normandy invasion or island hopping campaign of World War II. So I'm not sure we've mastered the craft per se.
Correct. But I mean, if American training resembled that, I suspect the Chinese amphibious assault training resembles what 1700s attempts to take over Burma. I mean, I think it's the last time they did it.
Yeah, I read some analysts claiming that China is several years away from necessary amphibious assault capabilities to take on Taiwan. I actually do not know how they quantify this. Like, for instance, our AAV slowly floating towards the shore sounds like not such a hot idea, assuming your enemy has something besides small arms.
Correct. Yeah, and Taiwan has a lot of fun stuff. In a really interesting way, the one thing that I know there were public announcements, Taiwan bought huge number of very modernized TOW missiles, which are anti-tank missiles in principle, but you can, with the modern seekers, you can use them for all sorts of stuff. And they have much better range, obviously, than all the smaller things like the javelins and other things. I mean, with the number of TOWs they have, I mean, they can do all sorts of damage even over water.
As far as I recall, TOW is pretty close to javelin.
So modern one is different. So it started out as a wire-guided missile. It's now wireless, and it's a larger missile. It has more fuel. It has notably more pop and more range. in its modern version. I don't think Taiwan has the most modern version, but there have been some interesting announcements about how many of them they've been purchasing, and the Javelins, and you name it, right? And the big thing was the anti-ship stuff. But the catch is that, so one of the things that everybody is afraid of with China, or at least talks about with China, is just sheer numbers, right? Because they have the Coast Guard and the fishing fleet, and all of that is basically just the Chinese Navy. So one of the potential complications with the Chinese assault is just a huge number of small ships, because they don't really care about their own losses too much. And all of these, interestingly, all of these small anti-tank-ish or slightly modified missiles are really great for small maritime vessels. So it's kind of an interesting thing.
Well, there was a chance that we would try to see, I should say, a Russian amphibious assault of Odessa, but I guess they completely changed their mind at this point.
So there is somebody there with the three brain cells next to each other still. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's another. Jared is full of good ideas today. Maybe Russia will sell China the Kamchatka Peninsula, which Lenin tried to lease to the US in the 1920s. If anybody is selling Kamchatka Peninsula, we should buy it. I will go on the record with that. It's a beautiful place. Okay. All right. So I think we've sort of exhausted the possibilities of China for the time being. What's next on our list?
Let's see. What are the interesting things happening? Well, France kind of got caught, but not quite, selling weapons to Russia. So,
well, I know they have been selling weapons to Russia fairly continuously over the last 15 years at pretty good numbers.
After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a general decision not to sell, and there was an order against weapon sales to Russia. But there was a caveat for pre-existing orders, etc.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and apparently France sold thermal equipment and guidance systems to Russia up until 2020, I believe, at least. So,
okay.
Yeah, not surprising.
Yeah, I was vaguely aware of that. So I know that all of the Russian missile seekers and things like that, they are all based on French imaging cores. But I didn't know they were selling it to them as late as 2020. That's interesting.
Yeah, we had visit by Czech, Polish, and Slovenian heads of states to Kiev, which sounds pretty insane, but I guess it gives some sense of where they feel that the war is, if they're willing to make the journey. So,
look, if you were a small country in, Eastern Europe, you would be showing your solidarity with Ukraine every which way possible, because if God forbid Russia succeeds, who knows who's next, right?
Yep. In the Russia, things continuing kind of worse than expected for Putin. There were the continuous protests on the streets, not the mass ones that actually threatened the regime, but given the 3 to 15-year sentence advertised, that's still impressive that they're ongoing and thousands of people getting arrested. We had a set of notable resignations in Russian media, anchors and
I saw that some lady proactively first got out of Russia, then resigned remotely from Europe, just in case. That's very smart.
Correct. I think she went to Israel and resigned from there. I don't remember exactly. Then there was another producer that appeared on TV with anti-war sign behind the anchor, and she got arrested, but then released, and it was a $300 bail apparently, which was surprisingly lenient. I thought that she'll disappear, and after that there was 7 or 8 resignations that I read about by different kind of media personalities.
Oh, that's interesting. We should figure out where all these people are and give them a green card. Maybe that'll promote more widespread protests.
Correct. Peace talks are ongoing. As I said, I'm kind of curious about very optimistic signals that Ukrainian spokesmen are willing to project about how those are going. I do not know. I probably would not share any news until it's literally the news.
Yeah.
But maybe this is kind of a tactic of pressuring Russia. There was a 16,000 Syrian special forces that Putin claimed will join the war. Those
Okay.
failed to materialize, similar to 40-mile column
Oh,
of Russian troops.
why can't we send 16,000 Syrian special forces into Ukrainian winter? I
Yeah,
would really love to. Or spring, fine. Spring is good.
yeah. Idea sounds hilarious, but
It is funny.
unfortunately failed to materialize in any
Oh,
way. So that's out of the window. Yeah, actually the weather conditions gotten worse. It gotten warmer. So whichever roads that are not paved became much less passable. This is very well-known condition in Russia. If you read Russian literature,
yeah, pretty
this
much.
is
Yeah,
the worst time to wage a war in Russia
yeah.
historically, which is
Spring. Yeah.
very interesting that Russian military was not aware of that.
Yeah, apparently. I talked. I have a lot of American friends, and when they ask me about why nobody can occupy Russia, I always tell them the story about, let's say, you're German, Swedish, whatever, whoever has invaded Russia at some point, Napoleon. You start in late spring, and it's beautiful, right? You start marching in. Summer is wonderful. A few mosquitoes, but otherwise it's great. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It's awesome. You make good progress. That's a large territory, right? You're still moving along nicely when it starts drizzling. And it basically starts raining until the whole country turns into a freaking mud bowl. And you think rain is gonna stop at some point. Yes, rain stops and becomes snow, and now you're frozen in this mud. And if you survive the winter and you think you can do great now, you can continue your progress. When all that stuff melts, you're back in the mud, right?
Yeah.
And as you said, it's amazing that Russian troops haven't figured that out. But yes,
Yeah, it's literally right now the worst time for campaign historically. So yeah, that's interesting. We had one incident of a missile exploding over Donetsk with what seems like cluster munition, killing 21 person and wounding 30 plus. So this is the first incident of this kind that I'm aware of, where if it's fired by Ukrainians, this would be fired primarily against civilians. It could also be fired by Russians. Probably very difficult to tell at the moment.
Okay, interesting. I heard I'm sort of surprised by how many kind of a right-wing gun bloggers are pro-Russian in this one. So we have a Discord server in the back that I occasionally listen to, and they're publishing all sorts of crazy Russian stories. People reporting how it is all Ukrainians killing civilians, and noble Russian troops are just trying to liberate the place. It's really, really interesting. One thing to keep in mind, right? War is war. War is unpleasant, and I can guarantee that both sides have managed to hit civilians. But once again, in this conflict, it's unquestionably Russia is the bigger asshole. So always something to keep in mind. All right. So what else we got? That's worth talking about.
Yes, there was a comment about no territory captured by Ukraine. That's not strictly speaking true. So as I mentioned, both areas around Kharkov and Kiev, and apparently near Kherson as well. Not in immediate vicinity, but in general area of Kherson, where you saw Russians lose the ground. Now it's not. We're not talking about mass rout where whole armies are retreating, but that's definitely a new trend. Basically, every day right now there are some counteroffensives in which Russians are falling back somewhat, usually a few kilometers. But this was not the case even 4 days ago.
Okay. So they're taking back some territory. It's not a bad thing. Does Ukraine and Russia supply wheat and corn to Europe? Yes. Russia just announced they will stop all exports of food because they realize that soon enough all they'll have in Russia is oil and bread and nothing else. And they need the bread to be able to sell the oil. Ukraine used to be really a serious breadbasket for a significant part of Europe, and that's obviously going to come to grinding halt for a little bit. Will the US fill the gap? US is capable of filling the gap. We don't know if it will, right? We are capable of growing more food, but growing more food does not happen overnight. You sort of need to plan this a year or so in advance, or at least a few months. So for a little while in the poorer parts of the world, there will be food shortages. Africa, Middle East, those are the places I think who depend on Russia and Ukraine the most in terms of food. Thoughts?
I am not aware of details of the food supply. I mean,
Yeah,
generally,
I looked at that a little bit yesterday. It was kind of interesting. We can have some, like Middle East and North Africa will have some serious problems unless America decides to step in and help. So
yeah.
interesting. So all the fun stuff is not happening. Kadyrov is not going to Ukraine. Syrians are not in Ukraine. All we've got to talk about is all the mundane issues of growing wheat and corn. Is there a lot of corn grown in Russia and Ukraine? I remember Khrushchev liked corn, so planted a lot of it. Is it still there?
Well, famously, it failed to grow.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's still the
Yeah, when I
main-
was a kid, there were large cornfields, and I remember we were going over stealing corn, and the local collective farm people were not happy with us. Brooks Precision. Is the Black Sea accessible from the Mediterranean? Yes. The Bosporus Straits, which are controlled by Turkey, connect Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Turkey is, for the time being, is not inclined to let anyone through there. They can probably be convinced because they are supporting Ukraine fairly nicely. But technically, you can't get into the Black Sea from the Mediterranean and vice versa unless Turkey lets you.
Yeah, so I think by agreement, you can always leave Black Sea. So Russian naval ships can leave Black Sea, but they cannot enter at the moment.
Correct. So, for example, if Russia wants to move their Baltic fleet or Far East fleet to the Black Sea, Turkey will not let them. So, okay, that's an interesting question about the no-fly zone. Does no-fly zone equal to World War III?
Well, part of it is the desire to start World War III. Mike, again, like I famously failed with claiming that Russia will not go for full-out invasion because it sounded so implausible for various reasons. I guess they had to find out themselves why it was implausible.
Correct.
So I have similar view of World War III, and I hope nobody will surprise me because I think it's very much not in Russian interest. If you want to commit suicide, there are many ways to do this. This would be the more painful one.
That's a fair point. Look, I mean, this is a big discussion about no-fly zone and all that. Honestly, I think we should have done it already. It would have helped Ukrainians tremendously, and I don't think Russians could do anything other than talk sternly.
Yeah, basically, as I mentioned at the beginning, my view is that Russia probably understands that they will fail to achieve their military goals. So it's just a question how quickly they realize that continuing doesn't make sense. And no-fly zone or any other strong responses that convince them that there is no chance that West will change their mind will only make them fold faster. That's my guess.
Okay, a brief interaction. Mr. Jeremiah Alexander from Right On is here. I think it's the first time he's on my live cast. Good to see you here, sir. You should really join the next one that's going to be on thermal optics. That's the one I promised you where I'll tell you how it all works. Anyhow, going back to politics. So here's continuing on the Black Sea thing. Wonder why Mariupol couldn't get support from the sea. So Mariupol is even more complicated because not only you have to get in there from the Mediterranean, first in the Black Sea, but then into the Azov Sea, which is basically like a small gulf for all practical purposes. And entrance to that one is completely controlled by Russia. So there is one way to get in there called the Kerch Strait, Kerch. And it's a small strait between Russia proper, southern Russia, and the Crimea. If you want to fight through there, you have to bring in some serious forces. You can't just swim around there willy-nilly. It doesn't work. Okay. SIG. No-fly zone means engaging targets in Russia. And as an example, Russia shot down one Ukrainian Su-27 with a SAM from 150 miles. That can be suppressed, basically.
I'm actually not 100% clear on the statement. You do not need to engage targets in Russia. I mean, yes, obviously it's preferable to do that. That would be more of a aerial control, but you don't have to. You could engage only things in Ukrainian airspace, and that would still be a very significant setback for Russia.
Well, I mean, so I think the point is that if Russian anti-aircraft batteries start engaging the planes that are enforcing the no-fly zone, then you're going to have to suppress something on Russian territory. Russian aircraft tracking systems are not hugely sophisticated. Taking down a Boeing or an Su-27 is not the same thing as taking down an F-35. Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? Honestly, we don't know for sure, but as far as avionics go, my money is on the F-35. But yeah, you're right. If Russia decides to challenge the no-fly zone, and my contention is that at this stage they know better than to do that. But if Russia decides to challenge the no-fly zone, that you would have to hit targets in Russia.
Yeah, so I'm not convinced that Russia wants to shut down U.S. plane at this point.
Yeah, that would bring all sorts of consequences that nobody will enjoy in the slightest. There have been some interesting reports from Russia a little while back during the Trump presidency. They were, Russians were doing all sorts of interesting stuff in Syria. There's some atrocities that they committed there. Even the Arabs were impressed, and that's saying something. But there were a couple of incidents where the Russians were getting too close to the assets that Americans cared about, and there were a couple of examples of what the American military can do from a good distance, and it stopped all of the questionable activities right there on the spot. So I think that's the best way I can say this. Jeremiah Alexandra suggests that we send some F-22 Raptors. Sure, any real stealth airplane will give Russian tracking systems a run for the money, even if they're using French equipment. All right, so we are getting close to my sort of self-imposed hour limit. We've got about 8 minutes left. Oh, that's actually a good question. Does anyone have drones that could enforce a no-fly zone? That seems like the way to do it. You want to address this, or should I?
Yeah, it's probably I don't have sufficient knowledge. Sounds unlikely, but I honestly do not know.
So basically, at this stage, we do not have drones that can do that. We're not very far away from it, but not yet. Okay. Would US and NATO air power neutralize the tanks and supply chain? They can, definitely. Like I said, you can. I think who was it? Last time or somewhere Eugene was looking at the pictures of this 40-mile long convoy of Russian armor and thinking, a couple of A-10s. They're like, any A-10 pilot will pay to go there, right?
Again, I think there is a mistake in the question. You cannot neutralize something that doesn't exist. So Russian supply chains, for all practical purposes, non-existent at the moment.
That's fair, but the tanks do exist. I mean, they're mostly neutralized, but you can neutralize them more thoroughly.
Have you seen that video of a Ukrainian village where every house has a Russian armored personnel carrier? Apparently, the Russian battalion drove in and they all ran away, and the villagers didn't know what to do, so each one took a personnel carrier parked in their lot. This was,
Yeah, okay, that's it. No, I have not seen that. That's interesting.
You have to be careful. When you're flying over Ukraine, you're going to see a lot of Russian armor, but some of it used by peaceful people.
Okay, so you don't need to bomb all of it. That's fair. Yeah. Okay, so no-fly zone in Ukraine means you need air supremacy, not just superiority. Supremacy means also suppression of enemy air defenses. Correct. That's what we were just. That's what we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no question that we have the capability to do it. The question is if there is a will and if there is a need. I can make a reasonable argument that there may be a need, although it's kind of dissipating. I can make an even better argument that there is no will to do that. Well, clearly, since it hasn't been done. Russia's population is in serious decline due to low birth rates. Very, very true. What are they going down like 1% a year right now, something like that? I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember the numbers, but yeah, it's
younger than average mortality compared to the West, and also much shorter lifespan for Russian men than women. It's especially a big deal for men, and no real immigration. This war seems to be increasing that speed. Yeah, probably.
I mean, net, we're talking about fairly small numbers, luckily.
Yeah.
When we're talking about a country of 138 million, 13,000 casualties does not change population size that much. It does undermine military capabilities a lot.
Well, I mean, another point to keep in mind, right? So the people who are getting killed are mostly young to middle-aged men, mostly young men, right? So in terms of having a longer-term effect on population, the 10,000 killed from one very, very specific age and gender demographic can actually have an impact, longer-term impact, right? So for those, but good news for those who in a few years will be looking for Russian brides, there will be more young single women available. All right, that's my attempt at the humor. Some A-10 flight teams are going bonkers looking at the news. That's very likely. And Brooks Precision, I have seen lots of pictures with Ukrainian farmers towing Russian tanks home. So one thing to keep in mind, right? So bullshit comes from all sides, not just from Russian side. So you have to be a little bit careful. The many pictures of Ukrainian farmers towing tanks home could be one farmer towing one tank, and many pictures taken from different angles, right? We really don't have very good data what's happening. There is enough data to say that Russian armor is not exactly distinguishing itself, right? And the will of Russian soldiers to fight is really not there. Best I can tell, their morale is god awful at this stage, as it should be.
So
when was it?
The leading number for losses does not come from vehicles destroyed, but vehicles abandoned. So there's plenty of functional abandoned vehicles right now
correct.
in Russia. So I don't know how many of them get towed by truck, but there's definitely no shortage of vehicles.
I'm not arguing it. I'm just basically advising caution when we look at the news. I mean, as time goes on, the real numbers will come out, and I suspect Eugene is right, or we're very close to real numbers. It's somewhere in average, but it's not as good as Russians say, and it's not as good as Ukrainians say. If you look at it from the other angle. Okay.
By the way, that's kind of another interesting thing that Russia came out with 500 number day 5, I believe, of the conflict. 500 lost personnel, and they never came back with a revised number. At least I haven't seen any announcement.
It's actually a good point. I have not seen any official casualty numbers from Russia since that 500 number. But like with authoritarian regimes, I remember when COVID started. And to this day, if you look at how many people China officially lists dead from COVID, it's like 3,000 or 4,000, something like that. I mean,
okay.
When you have statistics coming out of authoritarian countries, you really shouldn't pay any attention to them.
Well, if numbers starts going down fast, you know that there's something fishy going on.
Yeah, 500 dead. Oh no, we found 100 alive. Now it's 400. Yeah, that's always likely. Okay. All right, guys. Last question. And then we wrap up because I've got things to do. Going once. Going twice. Sold. Mr. Asya Chung, thank you for your insight. Thank you guys for chiming in. I really do appreciate it. Just to be clear, neither one of us is an expert on war or an expert on Russia, but Eugene has better insight in the war than most of us, and we both have some insight on Russia that most Americans do not have. Thank you guys for chiming in. I really do appreciate it. And I'm off on a hunting trip, so I'll be incommunicado for a few days. There's no internet there. I'll be back next week, and we will go from there. Thank you.
Thank you.